There was a time when thinking was slow. When every calculation demanded human hands, human eyes, human patience. When armies of clerks sat in vast rooms, scratching numbers onto paper, checking and rechecking, knowing that a single error could collapse an empire's finances, doom a naval mission, or sentence thousands to starvation because the grain shipments had been miscounted. The world moved at the speed of the human mind, and the human mind was tired. Before the digital age, before the hum of processors and the glow of screens, humanity lived in a prison of its own making. A prison built from limitations we couldn't even see. We were surrounded by problems too vast to solve, questions too complex to answer, patterns too intricate to detect. The universe spoke in mathematics, but we could only listen in fragments, struggling to hear the symphony through the noise of our own inadequacy. This is a story about the man who broke that silence. But first, you must understand what silence sounds like. Imagine standing in a room in 1920 in London, in Berlin, in New York. The greatest minds of the age bent over desks, computing artillery trajectories by hand. Slide rules clicking. Logarithm tables being consulted. Hours spent on calculations that we now complete in microseconds. And still the errors crept in. Still the shells missed their targets. Still, the bridges collapsed because someone had misplaced a decimal point 3 pages back in a ledger no one had time to double-check. The world was drowning in its own complexity and no one knew how to swim. This wasn't just inconvenience. This was death. This was waste. This was human potential shackled to the brutal arithmetic of limitation. Every scientific advancement slowed to the pace of manual calculation. Every great project, constructing dams, planning cities, organizing supply chains, ground to a halt while someone, somewhere, sat hunched over a desk, adding numbers until their eyes burned and their hands cramped. We were trapped in mechanical time. The age of steam and steel had given us power over matter, but not over thought. We could move mountains, but we couldn't think faster than our grandfathers. The Industrial Revolution had mechanized muscle, but the mind remained stubbornly human, stubbornly slow, stubbornly prone to the same errors that had plagued mathematicians since Babylon. And then the world started moving faster than thought could follow. The 20th century arrived like a thunderstorm, and suddenly the old pace wasn't just slow, it was lethal. The First World War demonstrated this with brutal clarity. Modern warfare required calculations on an unprecedented scale. Ballistics, logistics, cryptography, supply chains spanning continents. The side that could think faster, calculate more accurately, process more information, that side would survive. The other side would drown in the flood of data, making decisions too slowly, arriving at conclusions too late, dying because they couldn't compute quickly enough to stay alive. The war ended, but the problem didn't. In fact, it metastasized. The 1920s and 30s saw the world growing more interconnected, more bureaucratic, more dependent on information. Stock markets, insurance tables, census data, weather prediction, navigation, communications. Every advancement in one area created exponential complexity in another. The more sophisticated civilization became, the more desperately it needed some way to process the avalanche of information it was generating. Governments kept secrets in codes. Businesses tracked transactions across oceans. Scientists studied problems that generated thousands of equations. And all of it, every single calculation, had to be done by hand by human computers, mostly women, sitting in rooms with adding machines, performing the same operations over and over, knowing that their exhaustion would eventually lead to mistakes, and those mistakes would ripple outward into the real world where people lived and died according to whether the numbers were right. The question burning in the minds of mathematicians and engineers wasn't whether we needed machines that could think. The question was whether such machines were even possible. Could metal and electricity somehow replicate the mysterious process happening inside the human skull? Could you teach a machine to reason, to follow logical steps, to arrive at conclusions? Most people thought the answer was no. Thought was biological, spiritual, essentially human. You might as well try to teach a locomotive to write poetry. But there were a few who wondered. A few who looked at the gears and switches and electrical circuits being developed for other purposes and asked, what if? What if thinking wasn't as mysterious as we assumed? What if it was just another process, another mechanism, something that could be broken down into steps and reproduced? This was the atmosphere into which Alan Matheson Turing was born. June 23, 1912. London. The son of a civil servant working in the Indian Civil Service, a family of comfortable but not extraordinary means. There was nothing about his birth to suggest that this child would change the fundamental nature of human civilization. No prophecies. No signs. Just another baby in Edwardian England, arriving in a world that still believed thinking was something only humans could do. But from the beginning, Alan Turing was different. Not in the ways that make for easy hero stories. He wasn't a prodigy giving lectures at age 5. He wasn't born into privilege that opened doors. He was awkward, physically clumsy, socially inept in ways that marked him as odd even in childhood. His handwriting was atrocious. His teachers found him frustrating, obviously intelligent, but unable or unwilling to follow the standard curriculum. He asked questions that didn't fit the lesson plan. He solved problems using methods no one had taught him. He seemed to operate according to logic only he could perceive. Young Alan saw patterns where others saw chaos. Numbers spoke to him in ways they didn't speak to other children. While his classmates struggled with multiplication tables, Alan was fascinated by deeper questions. Why did numbers behave the way they did? What was really happening when you added or subtracted? What were the hidden structures underlying arithmetic? He was lonely. Of course he was lonely. Children who think differently are always lonely. The other boys at Sherborne School, where he was sent at age 13, found him strange. He ran oddly. He spoke oddly. He cared about things they didn't care about and didn't care about things they found important. Sports baffled him. Social hierarchies confused him. The unwritten rules that govern how children interact with each other, rules most people absorb unconsciously, remained forever opaque to Alan Turing. But then he met Christopher Morcom. Christopher was everything Alan wasn't. Handsome, athletic, socially graceful. But Christopher was also brilliant, passionate about science and mathematics, and for reasons that Alan never quite understood, Christopher wanted to be his friend. They talked about astronomy. They discussed mathematics. They shared ideas about the universe and how it worked. For the first time in his life, Alan Turing wasn't alone. The friendship probably saved him. Certainly it changed him. Christopher gave Alan something to aspire toward, not just intellectual achievement but a way of being in the world. A model of what it might mean to be both brilliant and human, both analytical and connected to others. And then Christopher died. Bovine tuberculosis. February 1930. Alan was 17 years old. Christopher Morcom, his only real friend, the person who had made the world feel less hostile, was gone. The grief was overwhelming. But grief, for a mind like Turing's, doesn't stay abstract. It demands answers. It becomes a problem to be solved. Alan began thinking obsessively about the nature of mind and matter. If Christopher's mind, his consciousness, his personality, his brilliant mathematical intuition, was just the product of physical processes in his brain, then what happened to all that when the body died? Was consciousness something separate from matter, some kind of spirit that persisted? Or was it entirely material, just patterns of electrical activity that ceased when the brain stopped functioning? These weren't just philosophical questions for a grieving teenager. They were the beginning of Turing's lifelong obsession with the fundamental question of computation. What is thinking? What is mind? Is consciousness something special and mysterious, or is it a process, a mechanism, something that could in principle be understood, replicated, perhaps even built? The death of Christopher Morcom set Alan Turing on the path that would lead to modern computing. Because to honor his dead friend, to understand what had been lost, Turing had to understand the nature of thought itself. He had to know whether the mind was magic or mechanism. And if it was mechanism, if thinking was just a very complicated process following definite rules, then perhaps that process could be performed by something other than a human brain. At Cambridge University, where he arrived in 1931, Turing threw himself into mathematics with ferocious intensity. But his approach was different from his peers. Most mathematicians worked within established frameworks, solving problems using known techniques. Turing kept asking deeper questions. He wasn't content to prove theorems. He wanted to understand what proof itself meant. What was really happening when you demonstrated that something was true? This led him to the work of Kurt Gödel, the brilliant Austrian logician who had recently shocked the mathematical world with his incompleteness theorems. Gödel had proven that in any sufficiently complex mathematical system, there would always be true statements that couldn't be proven within that system. Mathematics, it turned out, couldn't be completely formalized. There would always be truths beyond reach. But Turing read Gödel's work and saw something different. He saw a question that Gödel hadn't quite answered. Gödel had shown that some problems were unprovable, but there was a related question. Could you determine in advance whether a problem was solvable? Could you create a procedure, an algorithm, that would tell you whether any given mathematical problem could be solved? This was called the Entscheidungsproblem, the decision problem, and it was one of the great unsolved questions in mathematics. David Hilbert, the most influential mathematician of the age, had posed it years earlier. Was there a mechanical process that could determine the truth or falsity of any mathematical statement? Turing, at age 23, set out to answer it. But to answer the question, he needed to define what a mechanical process actually meant. What did it mean for something to be computable? What was the essence of calculation? And here, in a moment of extraordinary insight, Turing invented something that didn't exist: the universal computing machine. He imagined a device, purely theoretical, existing only in his mind and on paper, that could perform any calculation that could be performed by following a definite set of rules. The machine would have a tape, infinitely long, divided into squares. Each square could contain a symbol or be blank. The machine would have a reading head that could move left or right along the tape, reading symbols and writing new ones according to a set of instructions. The instructions themselves were simple. Read the current symbol, consult a table of rules, write a new symbol, move left or right, change to a new state. That was it. That was the entire mechanism. And yet, Turing proved, this absurdly simple machine could perform any calculation that any human computer could perform. Any mathematical process that could be broken down into definite steps could be executed by this machine. It was universal. It could simulate any other machine, compute any computable function. The implications were staggering. Turing had shown that computation wasn't some mysterious human faculty. It was a mechanical process that could be precisely defined. And if it could be defined, it could be built. The machine in Turing's head could, in principle, be made real. But he had also proven something darker. He showed that the Entscheidungsproblem had no solution. There could be no universal method for determining whether a given problem was solvable. Some questions would always remain undecidable. Even machines that could think couldn't think their way out of every maze. Turing published his paper, On Computable Numbers with an Application to the Entscheidungsproblem, in 1936. He was 24 years old. The paper laid the theoretical foundation for all of modern computing. Every computer, every smartphone, every digital device ever created is essentially a physical instantiation of Turing's universal machine. But almost no one noticed. The paper was too abstract, too theoretical. It was published in an academic journal read by specialists in mathematical logic. To the wider world, including most mathematicians, it seemed like an interesting but purely philosophical exercise. A clever thought experiment. Nothing more. Turing himself seemed uncertain about what he had created. He went to Princeton to study with Alonzo Church, who had independently developed a different but equivalent model of computation. He wrote a PhD dissertation on entirely different topics. He seemed, to his colleagues, like a brilliant but scattered young mathematician pursuing various interesting but disconnected problems. No one understood that Turing had just invented the future. And then history intervened. September 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain declared war. The world was burning again, and this time the fire would consume everything. But this war would be different from the last one. This war would be fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with information, with codes and ciphers, with the ability to keep secrets and the ability to steal them. And Alan Turing, the awkward, socially inept mathematician who had theorized about universal machines in the abstract space of pure logic, was about to discover that his ideas had very real applications. Britain's government code and cipher school recruited him almost immediately. They knew his reputation as a mathematician, his work on complex logical problems. They needed people who could think about patterns, who could see structures that others missed. They needed people who could break codes. The primary target was Enigma. The Germans had developed a cipher machine that seemed unbreakable. Enigma looked like a typewriter crossed with a telephone switchboard, but its internal mechanism was diabolically clever. It used rotating wheels, called rotors, that scrambled letters according to complex electrical pathways. Each time you pressed a key, the rotors moved, changing the encryption pattern. The machine had billions of possible starting configurations, and the Germans changed the settings daily. Every significant German military message was encrypted using Enigma. Naval positions, troop movements, U-boat coordinates, strategic plans. If the Allies could break Enigma, they would have a window into the German war machine's thoughts. They would know where the enemy was, where they were going, what they were planning. But breaking Enigma seemed impossible. The Polish Cipher Bureau had made initial progress in the 1930s, but the Germans had made the system more complex. The French had tried. The British had tried. Everyone agreed. Without knowing the daily settings, which the Germans changed every 24 hours, decryption would take longer than the heat death of the universe. Turing was sent to Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in the English countryside that served as the center of British code-breaking efforts. He arrived in September 1939, just as the war was beginning. He was 27 years old. He wore shabby clothes. He chained his coffee mug to a radiator so no one would steal it. He went running in old trousers held up with rope. The other codebreakers found him eccentric, to put it mildly. But when Turing looked at Enigma, he saw something no one else did. He saw it as a computational problem. Not a puzzle to be solved by clever intuition or lucky guesses, but a systematic process that could be mechanized. The problem wasn't that Enigma was unbreakable. The problem was that breaking it required trying so many possibilities that no human could do it quickly enough to be useful. But what if you didn't use humans? What if you built a machine? Turing designed something called the bomb, named after an earlier Polish device but vastly more sophisticated. It was electromechanical, using rotating drums to simulate the Enigma machine's rotors. But instead of encrypting messages, the bomb worked backward, testing possible settings at high speed, looking for contradictions, eliminating billions of wrong answers until only the right answer remained. The first bomb was installed at Bletchley Park in March 1940. It was loud, clicking and whirring constantly, generating heat, breaking down frequently. It looked like something from a nightmare, a mass of wires and wheels and relay switches. The operators, mostly young women from the Women's Royal Naval Service, had to monitor it constantly, checking for errors, adjusting settings, interpreting results. And at first it didn't work well. The early bombs were slow, unreliable. The Germans kept changing their procedures, adding complexity to Enigma. Turing and his team kept modifying the design, improving the logic, finding shortcuts. It was frustrating, exhausting work. Most of the time, the bombs produced nothing useful. They would run for hours, testing thousands of possible settings and come up empty. But sometimes, they found it. The correct setting. The key that unlocked that day's messages. And when they did, suddenly the German military's secret communications became readable. Positions of U-boats in the Atlantic. Orders to Luftwaffe squadrons. Strategic plans for major operations. The intelligence gathered at Bletchley Park, codenamed Ultra, would prove decisive. Historians estimate that the code-breaking work there shortened the war in Europe by 2 to 4 years. It saved countless lives. It changed the outcome of critical battles. When U-boats were located and sunk before they could attack convoys, that was Turing's work. When the Allies knew German troop positions before major offensives, that was Turing's work. When strategic decisions were based on perfect intelligence about enemy capabilities, that was Turing's work. But Alan Turing himself was miserable. Bletchley Park was a pressure cooker. The stakes were existential. Every day they failed to break the code was a day when Allied ships sank, soldiers died, operations failed. The work was relentless, exhausting, secret. They couldn't tell anyone what they were doing. They couldn't explain why they looked so tired, why they seemed distracted, why certain periods of the war felt so stressful to them while others didn't. And Turing, for all his brilliance, was still the same awkward, socially inept person he had always been. He clashed with colleagues. He couldn't navigate the bureaucratic and political aspects of the work. His ideas, when he tried to explain them to superiors who didn't have his mathematical background, sounded insane. He proposed things that seemed impossible, building even more complex machines, automating more of the decryption process, thinking multiple steps ahead of the Germans. There's a famous story, possibly apocryphal, about Turing biking to work in the early days of Bletchley Park. His bicycle chain had a fault that caused it to slip off every so often. Most people would have just taken it to be repaired. But Turing, being Turing, counted the number of pedal rotations between failures, derived the mathematical relationship governing when the chain would slip, and learned to stop pedaling just before the critical rotation. He fixed a mechanical problem with mathematics rather than with a wrench. This was how his mind worked. Everything was a pattern. Everything could be understood as a system following rules. Even something as mundane as a broken bicycle chain could be approached as a computational problem. And this was precisely the mindset needed to break Enigma. Because Enigma wasn't really about cryptography in the traditional sense. It was about information theory, about probability, about finding patterns in apparent randomness. It required someone who could think about thinking itself, who could model the process of encryption and decryption as a mechanical system, who could imagine machines that could perform logical operations. In other words, it required someone who had already theorized about universal computing machines. By late 1941, the bombs were working efficiently. Bletchley Park was decrypting thousands of German messages every day. The British government carefully controlled how this intelligence was used, making sure the Germans never realized their codes had been broken. When they sank U-boats based on Enigma decrypts, they always made sure there was a plausible alternative explanation. A reconnaissance plane, a surface patrol, something that wouldn't reveal the secret source. Turing's machines were thinking faster than the Germans could encrypt. The war of information had been won, even though the war of arms would drag on for years more. And in the process, Turing had proven something fundamental. Machines could perform logical operations. They could process information. They could, in a very real sense, think. But they weren't universal machines yet. The bombs were special-purpose devices designed for one specific task. They couldn't be reprogrammed to solve different problems. They were brilliant tools, but they weren't computers in the modern sense. Turing knew this, and he was already thinking about what would come next. During his time at Bletchley Park, in stolen moments between the urgent work of breaking codes, Turing began sketching ideas for a truly universal computing machine. Not a theoretical construct this time, but a real device that could be built with existing technology. A machine that could be programmed to perform any calculation, solve any computable problem, simulate any other machine. He called it the Automatic Computing Engine, ACE. It would use electronic circuits instead of mechanical relays, making it vastly faster than the bombs. It would have memory storing both data and instructions. Most importantly, it would be programmable. You could change what it did without rebuilding it. You could write a set of instructions, feed them to the machine, and it would execute them. This was the birth of the stored program computer, the architecture that underlies every computer built since. But Turing was still trapped in the wartime environment. His ideas were classified. His work was secret. He couldn't publish papers or present at conferences or collaborate openly with other researchers. He was one of the most important mathematicians in the world, but almost no one knew what he had accomplished. And there was something else. Something more personal. Something that would eventually destroy him. Alan Turing was homosexual. In 1940s Britain this was illegal. Not just socially unacceptable, actually criminal. The Sexual Offences Act of 1885 made gross indecency between men punishable by up to 2 years of hard labor. Oscar Wilde had been imprisoned under this law. Men were still being arrested, prosecuted, imprisoned for the crime of their sexuality. Turing knew this. He knew he was living in a society that considered his fundamental nature not just wrong but criminal. He knew that if anyone discovered the truth about him, everything he had worked for could be destroyed. At Bletchley Park he became engaged to Joan Clark, a fellow codebreaker. Joan was brilliant, kind, someone who understood him in ways most people didn't. The engagement lasted several months before Turing admitted the truth. He couldn't marry her. He was homosexual. It wouldn't be fair to her. Joan remarkably said she didn't care. She still wanted to marry him. They could make it work. But Turing, with the same brutal honesty he applied to everything else, said no. He wouldn't trap her in a marriage that couldn't be what she deserved. So he remained alone. Brilliant, essential to the war effort, unable to be honest about who he was with anyone except a few trusted friends. He couldn't talk about his work. He couldn't talk about his identity. He was a ghost even to himself. The war ended in 1945. The machines at Bletchley Park were destroyed or dismantled. The secrets were sealed. The codebreakers were sent home with strict instructions never to reveal what they had done. Alan Turing, who had arguably done more than almost anyone else to ensure an Allied victory, received no public recognition. No medals. No parades. No acknowledgement. He went back to being an obscure mathematician working on problems almost no one understood. But inside his head the future was taking shape. He had proven that machines could think, at least in the limited sense of performing logical operations. He had built devices that could process information, that could solve problems, that could reach conclusions. He had seen what was possible. Now he wanted to make it real. Word count, 4,247. The post-war world was exhausted, broke, traumatized. But it was also hungry for the future, desperate to believe that the nightmare of total war had led somewhere, meant something could be transformed into progress. Britain was rebuilding. America was ascendant. And quietly, in research laboratories and university departments, a handful of people who had worked on classified projects during the war were starting to talk about computers. Not mechanical calculators. Not special-purpose devices. Real computers. Universal machines that could be programmed to solve any problem. Turing joined the National Physical Laboratory in London in 1945, specifically to build his automatic computing engine. He had the designs mostly complete in his head. He knew what needed to be done. But translating ideas into engineering reality proved frustratingly difficult. The NPL was bureaucratic, slow, resistant to Turing's unconventional approaches. He wanted to build something revolutionary. They wanted to make sure it would work according to established principles. He proposed using then cutting-edge technology like mercury delay lines for memory. They worried about cost and reliability. He worked in bursts of intense focus, producing detailed designs and then wandering off to think about other problems. They wanted steady, predictable progress. And Turing, for all his genius, was not a manager. He couldn't sell his ideas effectively to administrators. He couldn't build political support. He couldn't compromise his vision to accommodate practical constraints. He was impatient with anyone who didn't immediately grasp what he was trying to achieve. The project dragged. Months became years. Other teams in America and Britain were building their own computers. ENIAC at the University of Pennsylvania, ETSAC at Cambridge. These machines borrowed heavily from ideas Turing had pioneered, but they would be completed first because their teams were better at engineering and project management. Frustrated, Turing moved to the University of Manchester in 1948, where he became deputy director of the Computing Machine Laboratory. Manchester was building its own computer, the Manchester Mark I, and it was actually getting built. Turing could work with a real machine instead of just theoretical designs. And it was at Manchester that Turing began thinking about the question that would obsess him for the rest of his life. Can machines think? Not in the limited sense of following programmed instructions. That was trivial, already proven. The deeper question, could a machine ever be truly intelligent? Could it have consciousness? Could it think in the way humans think, creatively, unpredictably, with genuine understanding? In 1950, Turing published what would become his most famous and influential paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. It opened with a simple question, can machines think? But Turing knew that thinking was too vague, too philosophical. You could argue forever about what thinking really meant. So he reframed the question in operational terms. Instead of asking whether a machine could think, ask whether a machine could successfully imitate a human being. Could you have a conversation with a machine and be unable to tell whether you were talking to a computer or a person? He proposed what's now called the Turing test. A human interrogator exchanges messages with two hidden participants, one human and one machine. If the interrogator can't reliably determine which is which, the machine passes the test. It has demonstrated intelligence, or at least something functionally equivalent to intelligence. The paper was brilliant, provocative, decades ahead of its time. Turing anticipated virtually every objection to machine intelligence that would be raised over the next 70 years. The theological objection, thinking is a function of the immortal soul. The consciousness objection, machines can't really understand, they just manipulate symbols. The mathematical objection, Gödel's incompleteness theorem shows limits to formal systems. The argument from disability, machines can't be creative, can't have emotions, can't truly learn. To each objection, Turing offered counterarguments that remain relevant today. Maybe consciousness isn't as special as we think. Maybe what we call understanding is itself just a sophisticated form of symbol manipulation. Maybe intelligence is a matter of degree rather than kind. Maybe machines will eventually do everything humans can do, just differently. He was describing artificial intelligence before the term existed. He was laying the philosophical foundation for a field that wouldn't fully emerge until decades later. And he was doing it with characteristic clarity and humor, demolishing objections with logic while acknowledging the genuine difficulties. But beneath the intellectual playfulness, there was something more personal. Turing was asking whether intelligence was separable from biology, whether mind could exist independent of human form. In a way, he was still asking the question that had haunted him since Christopher Morcom's death. What is consciousness? What makes us who we are? If a machine could think like a human, would that mean human thinking was less special? Or would it mean machines were more remarkable than we imagined? The academic world found the paper fascinating but largely theoretical. Real computers in 1950 could barely perform arithmetic, let alone carry on conversations. The idea that they might someday fool humans into thinking they were conscious seemed like science fiction. But Turing believed. He predicted that by the year 2000 computers would be able to pass his test. He was wrong about the timeline. No machine has definitively passed a rigorous Turing test even now in 2025. But he was right about the direction. He saw that intelligence was a problem computers would eventually tackle, that thinking was something machines would learn to simulate if not genuinely possess. And then, just as Turing's ideas were beginning to reach a wider audience, just as computers were transitioning from theoretical constructs to real devices changing the world, everything fell apart. In 1952, Turing's house was burgled. It was a minor crime, nothing unusual. But during the police investigation, something was revealed. Turing had been in a relationship with a young man named Arnold Murray. Murray knew the burglar. The connection was discovered. And suddenly, Alan Turing, war hero, mathematical genius, one of the most important scientists of the 20th century, was a criminal. He was arrested, charged with gross indecency. The crime was not theft or violence or fraud. The crime was being who he was, loving who he loved. The crime was existing in a body with desires the state had decided were illegal. Turing didn't hide. He didn't lie. When questioned by police, he admitted everything. He saw no reason to feel ashamed. Homosexuality was a fact about him, like having brown hair or being good at mathematics. Why should he pretend otherwise? His honesty destroyed him. The trial was brief. The evidence was his own testimony. He was found guilty. The judge gave him a choice: imprisonment or chemical castration. Probation with a condition that he submit to hormonal treatment designed to eliminate his libido, to chemically erase the part of himself that made him criminal in the eyes of the state. Turing chose the treatment. For a year, he was injected with synthetic estrogen. The effects were devastating. He developed breast. He suffered severe depression. His body became alien to him, reshaped by the same society that had depended on his genius to survive. And through it all, he kept working. He continued his research. He studied mathematical biology, investigating how patterns form in nature, how a fertilized egg develops into a complex organism, how spots appear on leopards, how structures emerge from apparent chaos. He published a groundbreaking paper on morphogenesis, the development of form and shape in living things. It was the same impulse that had driven all his work. The desire to understand the patterns underlying reality, to see the algorithms that govern both machines and living things. Mathematics everywhere, hidden structures waiting to be discovered. Even as his own life was falling apart, Turing was still trying to decode the universe. But the isolation was crushing. His security clearance was revoked. He was considered a security risk, now vulnerable to blackmail. His work with classified projects was over. Colleagues kept their distance, afraid of association with a convicted criminal. The man who had broken Enigma, who had helped save Britain from Nazi Germany, was now treated as a dangerous deviant who couldn't be trusted. On June 7, 1954, Alan Turing's housekeeper found him dead in his bedroom. Next to the bed was an apple, partially eaten. The apple had been laced with cyanide. He was 41 years old. The official verdict was suicide, though some have questioned this over the years. Turing had kept cyanide in his home for chemistry experiments. The apple was never tested. There were no witnesses. Some have suggested accident or even murder, though these theories remain speculative. But whether he took his own life deliberately or died by tragic accident, the result is the same. Alan Turing, one of the most brilliant minds in human history, was dead. Killed by a society that couldn't tolerate his existence. Destroyed by laws that treated love as crime. The world barely noticed. His obituary in the Times of London was brief and perfunctory, mentioning his work in mathematical logic but nothing about Bletchley Park. That was still secret. Most people didn't know who he was. Those who did know couldn't speak about his most important accomplishments. So he was buried in obscurity, one more obscure academic who had died young, mourned by a small circle of friends and colleagues who knew a fraction of what he had achieved. But his ideas survived. His machines survived. The computers being built in the 1950s and 60s were all descendants of Turing's theoretical work and wartime innovations. Every advance in computing, from mainframes to personal computers to smartphones to artificial intelligence, was built on foundations Turing had laid. The tragedy is that he didn't live to see it. He didn't see computers become ubiquitous. He didn't see the internet connect billions of people. He didn't see artificial intelligence develop from his thought experiments into real systems that can drive cars, translate languages, recognize faces, even generate text that sounds human. He didn't see his name become synonymous with computational thinking. He didn't see the Turing Award become the highest honor in computer science, the field's equivalent of the Nobel Prize. He didn't see his ideas about machine intelligence become the foundation for an entire branch of philosophy and technology. He didn't see himself vindicated. He didn't see the world realize what it had lost when it killed him. All he saw was rejection, persecution, and finally, one way or another, death. This is the first part of Alan Turing's story. The part about genius and sacrifice, about innovation born from necessity, about ideas that were too large for the world that contained them. It's the story of how one awkward, brilliant, isolated man laid the foundations for the digital age while being simultaneously essential and invisible. But it's only part of the story. Because Turing's greatest impact came after his death. His legacy is the world we live in now, the computational civilization we've built on his theoretical foundations. And understanding that legacy, understanding what it means that thinking can be mechanized, that intelligence can be artificial, that machines can process information in ways that rival or exceed human capabilities, requires us to look at what happened after he was gone. This is the story of how Alan Turing invented modern computing. But it's also the story of what we've done with his invention, what we've built and what we've lost, what we've gained and what we've sacrificed as we've transformed his abstract mathematical insights into the technological substrate of contemporary life. It's a story about progress and persecution, about genius and injustice, about the cost of being different and the price of being right too soon. It's the story of how we created machines that think, and what it means that we succeeded. And it begins in silence, in the world before computers, when thinking was slow and calculation was agony and the future existed only in the mind of one lonely mathematician who dared to imagine that machines might someday dream. The world didn't end when Alan Turing died. It kept turning, kept calculating, kept building machines that thought faster than humans ever could. But something was lost that June morning in 1954, something irreplaceable. The man who had imagined thinking machines before they existed, who had proven they were possible, who had built the first crude versions during a desperate war, that man was gone. And with him went decades of insight, of intuition about where computing could go, what it could become, what dangers it might pose. But the machines kept thinking. They had no choice. They didn't know their creator was dead. By 1960, computers were no longer theoretical constructs or classified military projects. They were real, physical objects filling entire rooms with their vacuum tubes and magnetic tape reels. IBM was building mainframes for businesses and governments. Universities were establishing computer science departments. A handful of programmers, the word itself was new, invented for people who wrote instructions for these machines, were learning to communicate with computers in languages the machines could understand. Fortran, COBOL, assembly language. These early programming languages were crude, limited, nothing like the elegant mathematical notation Turing had imagined. But they worked. You could write a program, feed it to the computer on punch cards, wait hours or days for the result, and if you'd made no mistakes, the computer would solve problems that would have taken human mathematicians years. The space race accelerated everything. When President Kennedy declared that America would put a man on the moon, he was really declaring that America would build the computers necessary to navigate to the moon. Every trajectory calculation, every orbital mechanic equation, every split-second guidance adjustment required computational power beyond human capability. The Apollo program wasn't just about rockets and astronauts. It was about computers. And those computers, every single one of them, were built on principles Turing had articulated decades earlier. The stored program architecture. The separation of hardware and software. The idea that a machine could be programmed to perform any computable function. These weren't just technical details. They were philosophical insights about the nature of computation itself, insights that Turing had discovered when he was trying to understand what it meant to think. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. Back on Earth, millions watched on television. Another technology that depended on electronic signal processing, another descendant of the digital revolution. The computers that guided Apollo 11 had less processing power than a modern calculator. But they were enough. They proved that machines could be trusted with human lives, that automated systems could perform tasks too complex and time-sensitive for human control. Turing would have been 57 years old. He would have understood, better than almost anyone, what an achievement this represented. Not just the engineering triumph of reaching another world, but the computational triumph of solving millions of equations in real time, of navigating through vacuum with nothing but mathematics and electronic circuits. He would have seen what was coming next. He always saw what was coming next. The 1970s brought something that would have delighted Turing: the beginning of miniaturization. Computers were shrinking, getting faster, becoming accessible to more than just governments and large corporations. The microprocessor, an entire computer's central processing unit etched onto a single chip of silicon, was invented in 1971. Suddenly, computational power that had filled rooms could fit in your hand. This triggered an explosion. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, personal computers were appearing in homes. Apple, Commodore, IBM PC. Machines that ordinary people could own, could program, could use to solve their own problems or play games or write letters or balance checkbooks. Computing was democratizing, spreading from classified military installations and corporate data centers into bedrooms and studies and school classrooms. And with this democratization came a cultural shift. A generation was growing up for whom computers weren't exotic or frightening but familiar, even mundane. Children learned to program in BASIC. Teenagers traded software on floppy disks. The first hackers, originally a term of respect, meaning someone who understood computers deeply enough to make them do unexpected things, were exploring the boundaries of what these machines could do. Turing had predicted this in a way. He had known that once you built a universal machine, once you proved that computation could be performed by something other than a human brain, the possibilities were endless. Every problem that could be formulated as a series of logical steps could be solved by a computer. And as machines got faster and cheaper, the range of solvable problems would expand exponentially. But he had also warned about something else. In his 1950 paper on machine intelligence, Turing had written, "We can only see a short distance ahead, but we can see plenty there that needs to be done." He knew that artificial intelligence would raise profound questions. Questions about consciousness and creativity. Questions about what makes humans special. Questions about whether machines could ever truly understand rather than just simulate understanding. These questions became urgent as computers grew more sophisticated. By the 1980s and 90s, machines were beating humans at tasks that required what seemed like intelligence. Deep Blue defeated world chess champion Garry Kasparov in 1997. Computers were diagnosing diseases, trading stocks, designing aircraft, proving mathematical theorems. They were encroaching on domains that had been exclusively human. And people started asking, are these machines thinking? Or are they just following very complicated instructions? Is there something inside these silicon chips that experiences the world, or are they philosophical zombies, performing intelligent behavior without any inner life? This was Turing's question, the one he'd posed half a century earlier. And we still don't have a definitive answer. We've built machines that can pass limited versions of the Turing test, that can generate human-like text and recognize faces and translate languages. But whether they understand anything, whether there's any there, that remains contested, mysterious, perhaps unanswerable. What's undeniable is the impact. The world has been transformed more radically in the decades since Turing's death than in any comparable period in human history. And the transformation is fundamentally computational. We live in a civilization built on information processing, on the manipulation of symbols according to rules, on the mechanization of thought that Turing first imagined in 1936. Consider what happened in the 1990s. The internet existed before then, created by the military and used by academics. But the World Wide Web, invented by Tim Berners-Lee in 1989, made it accessible to everyone. Suddenly, computers weren't just calculators or word processors. They were portals to a global network, connecting millions and then billions of machines into a single distributed computing system. This was Turing's universal machine writ large. Instead of one device that could simulate any other, we had billions of devices that could communicate with each other, share information, coordinate their activities. The network itself became a form of computation, with data flowing between nodes, being processed and transformed and stored and retrieved according to protocols that were themselves software, instructions telling machines how to talk to each other. And the pace accelerated. The 2000s brought smartphones, putting computational power equivalent to the Apollo mission computers in everyone's pocket. Search engines like Google made the sum of human knowledge accessible instantly. Social media connected billions of people in real-time conversations. E-commerce transformed retail. Streaming services changed how we consumed entertainment. GPS navigation made it nearly impossible to get lost. Every aspect of modern life became mediated by computers. Banking, shopping, communication, navigation, entertainment, work, education, dating, warfare, politics, medicine, science, all of it depended on computational systems processing information, making decisions, connecting people and data and machines. We were living inside Turing's vision, a world where thinking had been mechanized, where information was the fundamental currency, where silicon and software determined the shape of civilization. But Turing had also understood something darker. He knew that computation was power. The side that could process information faster, that could break the enemy's codes while keeping their own secrets, that side would win. He'd lived this during the war. He'd seen how ultra-intelligence, derived from breaking Enigma, had tilted the balance, saved lives, shortened the conflict. What he couldn't have fully anticipated was how this principle would scale. How computation would become not just a military advantage but the basis of economic dominance, social control, and geopolitical power. By the early 21st century, data was the most valuable resource on Earth. Not oil or gold or land but information. The companies that could collect, process, and monetize data became the most powerful entities in the world. Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, tech giants worth trillions of dollars, controlling platforms that billions of people use daily. And what these companies were doing, fundamentally, was computation at scale. They were processing information about human behavior, desires, relationships, movements, preferences. They were using algorithms, descendants of Turing's theoretical work on computable functions, to predict what you wanted, show you what you'd click on, sell you what you'd buy. The machinery of thought that Turing had invented to break Nazi codes was now being used to monetize attention, to manipulate behavior, to surveil populations. Every search query, every clicked link, every liked post, every location ping from your phone, all of it was data being fed into computational systems designed to extract value from human activity. This wasn't evil exactly. It was the logical outcome of mechanizing thought. Once you can process information automatically, at massive scale, the temptation to do so becomes irresistible. Governments want to track potential threats. Businesses want to understand customers. Platforms want to keep users engaged. And computers make all of this possible in ways that would have been unimaginable when people were doing calculations by hand. But there were costs. Privacy evaporated. The line between public and private blurred, then vanished. Your location, your purchases, your relationships, your interests, your medical conditions, your political beliefs, all of it became data stored on servers, analyzed by algorithms, potentially accessible to whoever controlled the computers. Turing himself had been destroyed by a state that deemed his private life criminal. He would have understood viscerally the danger of living in a surveillance state, of having intimate details about yourself stored in databases, analyzed, used to categorize and judge you. The man who had kept Britain's deepest secrets during the war, who had maintained operational security even under persecution, would have been horrified by how willingly people surrendered their privacy to computational systems they didn't understand and couldn't control. The military applications expanded too. By the 2000s, warfare was increasingly automated. Drones piloted by operators thousands of miles away. Targeting systems that used facial recognition and predictive algorithms. Cyber warfare, attacks that existed entirely in the digital realm, shutting down power grids, stealing classified documents, manipulating elections. Turing's theoretical work on computation had been motivated partly by the needs of war. The bomb was a weapon in its way, designed to give the Allies an information advantage. But the machines built on his principles became weapons themselves. Autonomous systems that could identify and kill targets without human intervention. AI-powered propaganda tools that could flood social networks with misinformation. Algorithms that could predict terrorist attacks or identify dissidents or optimize supply chains for military operations. The same technology that connected people and spread information and solved complex problems also enabled unprecedented forms of control and violence. The computational revolution was morally ambiguous, neither purely beneficial nor purely harmful, but tremendously powerful and increasingly inescapable. And then there was work itself. Computers were supposed to liberate humanity from drudgery, to take over repetitive tasks and free us for creative pursuits. In some ways this happened. Machines did replace human calculators, typists, switchboard operators, assembly line workers. Automation increased productivity, made goods cheaper, created new industries. But it also displaced millions of people whose skills became obsolete. Factory workers replaced by robots. Taxi drivers threatened by autonomous vehicles. Journalists competing with algorithms that could generate news stories. Radiologists whose expertise in reading X-rays was being matched by machine learning systems trained on millions of medical images. The pace of change was brutal. Previous industrial revolutions had unfolded over generations, giving people time to adapt, to learn new skills, to find new roles in the economy. But the computational revolution happened faster. A skill that took years to master could become obsolete in months. A career path that seemed stable could vanish as software learned to do the job better, cheaper, faster. And always, the machines got smarter. Machine learning and artificial intelligence, fields that Turing had essentially founded with his 1950 paper, were experiencing explosive growth. Neural networks, originally inspired by theories about how the human brain processes information, were being trained on massive datasets to recognize patterns, make predictions, generate content. By the 2010s and early 2020s, AI systems were producing results that seemed genuinely creative. Machines that could compose music, write poetry, generate photorealistic images, engage in conversation. They weren't conscious, or if they were, we had no way to know, but they were doing things that had been considered uniquely human. This raised Turing's question again more urgently than ever. What makes us special? If machines can think, can create, can communicate, can learn, can solve problems, what's left that only humans can do? What is consciousness really? Is it something mystical and irreducible, or is it just a very sophisticated computational process that happens to run on biological hardware? We don't know. Turing didn't know. The question remains open, perhaps permanently so. But what's clear is that the boundary between human and machine intelligence is blurring. Not because machines are becoming more human, but because we're recognizing that human intelligence might be more mechanical than we wanted to believe. Turing had seen this coming. He'd argued that objections to machine intelligence were often based on pride, on the assumption that humans were special, that our minds operated according to principles that couldn't be replicated in silicon. But his whole career was built on the opposite premise. That thinking was a process, that it followed rules, that anything following rules could be mechanized. If he was right, and the last 70 years of computational progress suggest he was, then consciousness might not be as mysterious as we think. It might just be what happens when you have a sufficiently complex information processing system. It might emerge from computation the same way Turing's universal machine could simulate any other machine. It might be less about the substrate, neurons versus transistors, and more about the organization, the patterns, the algorithms. This is simultaneously awe-inspiring and terrifying. Awe-inspiring because it suggests that consciousness could be created, that we might build machines that genuinely understand, that experience the world, that have inner lives. Terrifying because it suggests that our own consciousness isn't special, that we're just particularly sophisticated computers, that free will might be an illusion and subjective experience might be nothing more than the sensation of algorithms executing. Turing never got to grapple with these implications fully. He died too soon, before computers were advanced enough to really test his theories about machine intelligence. But he had started the conversation. He had asked the right questions, even if the answers remained elusive. And his legacy was everywhere. Not just in the specific machines descended from his work, but in the entire conceptual framework of the digital age. The idea that information could be processed automatically. The understanding that thinking was computational. The recognition that machines could be programmed to perform any well-defined task. The insight that hardware and software could be separated, that you could change what a machine did without rebuilding it. These weren't just technical achievements. They were philosophical insights that changed how humans understood themselves and their relationship to technology. We went from seeing ourselves as fundamentally different from machines, possessed of souls and consciousness and free will that no mechanism could replicate, to wondering whether we were machines ourselves, just very complicated ones. By the 2020s, artificial intelligence was advancing so rapidly that experts disagreed about whether we were 5 years or 50 years from human-level machine intelligence. Some argued we'd already achieved it in narrow domains. Others insisted that true AI, artificial general intelligence that could match human flexibility and understanding across all domains, remained impossibly distant. But everyone agreed that we were building increasingly powerful computational systems whose behavior we didn't fully understand and couldn't fully control. Neural networks with billions of parameters, trained on vast datasets, making decisions through processes that even their creators couldn't fully explain. Black boxes that worked but whose internal logic remained opaque. This was perhaps the deepest irony of Turing's legacy. He had tried to understand thinking by mechanizing it, by breaking it down into clear, logical steps. But the machines we built using his principles had become so complex that they were mysterious again. We'd gone full circle, from trying to understand the mystery of human thought, to building mechanical processes that followed clear rules, to creating automated systems so intricate that they exhibited emergent behaviors we couldn't predict or explain. The machines were thinking. We just didn't know how or why or what they were thinking about. And through it all, Alan Turing remained absent. His name was known in computer science, revered even. But the general public didn't know who he was, didn't understand what he'd contributed, didn't realize that the digital world they inhabited was built on foundations he'd laid. That began to change slowly in the decades after his death. Historians of science started uncovering the classified work at Bletchley Park. The Official Secrets Act that had kept the code-breaking operation hidden was gradually relaxed. Books were published. Documentaries were made. The story of Enigma and Ultra became public. And people started asking, who was Alan Turing? Why had this crucial figure in 20th century history been forgotten? What had happened to him after the war? The answers were uncomfortable. Britain had to confront the fact that it had persecuted and possibly killed one of its greatest heroes. The man who had helped save the nation from Nazi Germany had been treated as a criminal for his sexuality. The scientist who had founded computer science had been driven to death, whether by his own hand or by accident, while depressed and humiliated, because he loved men. It was shameful. And slowly, grudgingly, Britain began to acknowledge this. In 2009, Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued a public apology on behalf of the British government. He called Turing's treatment appalling and said, "We're sorry. You deserved so much better." It was 55 years too late, but it was something. In 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Turing a posthumous royal pardon. Again, decades too late. Again, a recognition that could do nothing for the man who had died in obscurity and disgrace. In 2019, the Bank of England announced that Turing would appear on the £50 note, the highest denomination of British currency. His face would be printed on millions of banknotes, circulating through the economy, seen by millions of people every day. The criminal had become a symbol of national pride. These gestures of rehabilitation were important, but they couldn't undo the damage. They couldn't give Turing back the decades of life he'd been denied. They couldn't erase the humiliation and suffering he'd endured. They couldn't restore his security clearance or his ability to work on the problems that fascinated him or his right to live openly as himself. All they could do was acknowledge, belatedly, that Britain had been wrong. That Turing had been extraordinary. That his persecution was a moral catastrophe. That we should have known better, should have treated him better, should have valued him for his genius rather than destroying him for his sexuality. But even these acknowledgments were limited. They focused on Turing as an individual tragedy, a great man brought down by unjust laws. What they didn't fully reckon with was the broader injustice. That thousands of other men were arrested, prosecuted, imprisoned, chemically castrated under the same laws that destroyed Turing. That homosexuality remained illegal in Britain until 1967. That discrimination against LGBTQ+ people continued for decades afterward and, in some forms, continues still. Turing wasn't just a victim of bad timing, born in an era before society became enlightened. He was a victim of systematic oppression, laws designed to punish and control people for who they were. And while he was exceptional in his genius, he wasn't exceptional in his suffering. Many others endured the same persecution without the eventual recognition, without the apologies, without their faces on banknotes. The rehabilitation of Alan Turing's reputation was necessary and overdue. But it couldn't be separated from the broader history of how societies treat difference, how they punish nonconformity, how they destroy people who don't fit prescribed categories. And here's another uncomfortable truth. The same computational systems that Turing invented are now being used to surveil, track, and in some countries, persecute LGBTQ+ people. Algorithms that can detect sexual orientation from social media activity. Facial recognition systems used to monitor queer communities. Data mining techniques that identify people seeking information about sexuality or gender identity. The machinery of thought that Turing built has become, in part, a tool for the same kind of oppression that killed him. Not because computation is inherently oppressive, but because any powerful tool can be used for control. And computational power is the most powerful tool humanity has ever created. This is the paradox of Turing's legacy. His work liberated humanity from the limitations of slow, manual thinking. It enabled scientific breakthroughs, economic growth, global communication, medical advances, artistic innovation. It expanded the boundaries of what was possible. But it also enabled new forms of surveillance, manipulation, warfare, and inequality. It created systems too complex to fully understand or control. It raised questions about consciousness and creativity and what makes us human, questions we're still struggling to answer. The digital age is Turing's gift to humanity. But like all profound gifts, it's double-edged. It amplifies our capabilities both for good and ill. It reveals as much about human nature as it does about machines. It shows us what we value, what we fear, how we treat each other, what we're willing to sacrifice for progress. By the year 2025, 7 decades after Turing's death, we are fully inhabitants of the world he envisioned. Computational thinking is second nature. We carry supercomputers in our pockets. We trust algorithms to recommend movies, navigate routes, diagnose diseases, approve loans, filter news, moderate speech. Artificial intelligence is advancing toward, or has already reached, depending on who you ask, capabilities that Turing explored theoretically. Large language models can engage in seemingly intelligent conversation. Image generation systems can create photorealistic pictures from text descriptions. Autonomous vehicles are navigating city streets. Machine learning systems are discovering new drugs, proving mathematical theorems, beating humans at ever more complex games. And we're confronting Turing's questions more directly than ever. When an AI system generates text that sounds human, is it thinking? When it produces art that moves us, is it being creative? When it appears to understand context and meaning, does it actually understand, or is it just very good at pattern matching? We don't have definitive answers. Perhaps we never will. But we're living in the reality Turing imagined. A world where machines think, where the boundary between human and artificial intelligence is contested, where computation shapes every aspect of existence. And still, few people know his name. Most of those billions of people using computers every day have never heard of Alan Turing. They don't know about Enigma or Bletchley Park. They don't know about the Turing test or the universal machine or the theoretical foundations of everything they're using. They just know that computers work. They know that you can search for anything and get answers instantly. They know that machines can do things that once seemed impossible. They don't think about where this came from, who made it possible, what it cost. This is perhaps fitting. Turing himself was secretive, private, uncomfortable with attention. He did his work not for glory but because the problems fascinated him, because he needed to understand, because he couldn't stop thinking about how things worked. But it's also tragic. Because Turing's story isn't just about scientific achievement. It's about being different in a society that punishes difference. It's about genius that goes unrecognized because it doesn't fit expected patterns. It's about the cost of progress, the sacrifices made by people who see further than their contemporaries. It's about what we do to those who are ahead of their time, how we treat them. Whether we listen or persecute, whether we elevate or destroy, whether we learn from them or silence them. The world that killed Alan Turing was built on the foundations he created. We are living inside his imagination, using machines descended from his theoretical work, grappling with questions he first articulated. Every time we use a computer, we are, in a sense, in conversation with Turing's ghost. And what would he think if he could see what we've built? Would he be proud? Horrified? Amazed? Disappointed? Perhaps all of those things. He would marvel at the technology, certainly. The processing power of a modern smartphone would seem like magic to someone who worked with vacuum tubes and mechanical relays. The global internet connecting billions of people would fulfill his vision of universal machines more completely than he could have imagined. The advances in artificial intelligence would vindicate his insistence that machines could think. But he would also see the surveillance state, the algorithmic manipulation, the privacy violations, the use of computational power to control and exploit. He would see that the same tools that liberate can oppress. He would understand better than most the dual nature of technology. And he would see a world that had, in some ways, moved beyond the prejudices that destroyed him. Gay marriage is legal in many countries now. LGBTQ+ rights have advanced dramatically. The laws that criminalized Turing's sexuality have been repealed. Pride parades happen in cities worldwide. What was illegal in 1954 is celebrated in 2025. But he would also see that the struggle continues. That in many countries, being gay is still criminal, sometimes punished by death. That discrimination persists. That the same impulses that led to his persecution, the fear of difference, the desire to control, the enforcement of conformity, still shape how societies treat those who don't fit prescribed norms. Progress is real but incomplete. We've come far but not far enough. We've learned some lessons but not all of them. This is the landscape of Turing's legacy. A world transformed by his insights, still grappling with his questions, still failing to fully honor his humanity. The machines keep thinking. They process information, execute algorithms, solve problems, simulate intelligence. They grow more sophisticated every year, approaching and perhaps eventually surpassing human capabilities in domain after domain. But they don't know why they exist. They don't wonder about their purpose. They don't ask what it means to think, to understand, to be conscious. They just compute, following the logical structures that Turing first defined, implementing the theoretical principles he discovered when he was trying to understand whether there were limits to what could be calculated. We know there are limits. Turing proved that with his solution to the Entscheidungsproblem. Not every problem can be solved. Not every question has a computable answer. There are truths beyond the reach of any algorithm, paradoxes that no machine can resolve. But within those limits, the possibilities are vast. And we're still exploring them, still discovering what can be computed, what can be automated, what can be understood through the mechanization of thought. This is Turing's gift and his curse. He showed us how to build thinking machines, how to automate intelligence, how to process information at speeds and scales impossible for biological brains. He gave us tools of tremendous power. But he couldn't tell us how to use them wisely. He couldn't prevent the surveillance, the manipulation, the algorithmic bias, the job displacement, the existential questions about machine consciousness. He could only show us that it was possible, that thinking could be mechanized, that the boundary between mind and machine was less clear than we assumed. What we do with that knowledge is our responsibility. The choices we make about how to build and deploy computational systems, how to regulate and govern them, how to balance their benefits against their harms, those are human choices, not computational problems. The machines can't make those decisions for us. They can only do what we program them to do, follow the goals we set, optimize the functions we define. The ethics, the values, the priorities, those come from us. And this is where Turing's absence is most painfully felt. Because he was not just a brilliant mathematician and computer scientist. He was someone who understood the human cost of abstraction, who knew what it meant to be judged and found wanting by systems that couldn't see his full humanity. He experienced directly the violence of treating people as problems to be solved, rather than as complex, irreducible individuals. If he were still here, if he had lived to see the computational revolution he sparked, perhaps he would have been a moral voice as well as a technical one. Perhaps he would have insisted that we remember the humanity at the center of all this machinery, that we build systems that serve people rather than controlling them, that we never forget what it means to be on the wrong side of an algorithm's judgment. But he's not here. He was taken from us too soon by a society that couldn't tolerate his difference. And so we're left to navigate the world he created without his guidance, trying to honor his legacy while avoiding the mistakes that killed him. The machines keep computing. The algorithms keep executing. The data keeps flowing through networks that span the globe, processed by silicon descendants of Turing's universal machine, implementing logical operations he first defined in the 1930s. And somewhere in all that computational activity, in the vast hum of information being processed, there's an absence. A ghost in the machine. The echo of a question asked by a man who died believing the world had no place for him. Can machines think? Can consciousness be mechanized? Is there a fundamental difference between human and artificial intelligence? We still don't know. But we're living inside the question, surrounded by thinking machines, becoming cyborgs ourselves as computation becomes increasingly integrated with biological existence. The boundary blurs more each year. The question becomes more urgent even as it becomes harder to answer. And perhaps that's Turing's ultimate legacy. Not the specific machines we've built, not the particular algorithms we use, but the questions we're forced to confront about what it means to think, to understand, to be conscious, to be human in an age when machines can do so many things we once believed only humans could do. The digital age is magnificent and terrible, liberating and oppressive, full of promise and fraught with danger. It amplifies both our best and worst qualities. It reveals us to ourselves even as it transforms us. And all of it, every line of code, every neural network, every algorithm, every computation, rests on foundations laid by a lonely, brilliant, persecuted man who died thinking he had failed, who never knew that his ideas would reshape human civilization, who couldn't imagine the world we built on the structures of thought he first discovered. Alan Turing survived persecution long enough to invent modern computing. But he didn't survive long enough to see what we would do with his invention. He gave us the tools to think faster than nature intended, to process information at scales beyond biological possibility, to automate intelligence itself. What we've built with those tools is both magnificent and monstrous. We've connected billions of people. We've solved problems that would have been impossible without computational power. We've extended human capabilities in ways that seem almost godlike. But we've also created systems of surveillance and control that would horrify the man who helped break Nazi codes. We've built algorithmic systems that replicate and amplify human prejudices. We've automated decision-making in ways that strip away context and humanity. We've made ourselves dependent on machines we don't fully understand. This is the world Turing made possible. Not because he intended these specific outcomes, but because he showed us that thinking could be mechanized, that intelligence wasn't limited to biological brains, that computation was a force that could be harnessed for any purpose we chose. The choosing, that's on us. The machines are neutral. They execute the instructions we give them, pursue the goals we define, optimize the functions we specify. The moral dimension, the ethical weight, the human consequences. Those emerge from how we design and deploy these systems, not from the systems themselves. And so Turing's legacy is incomplete. He gave us the tools. We're still figuring out what to build with them, what they cost, whether the price is worth paying. The only certainty is that there's no going back. We can't unlearn what Turing taught us. We can't uninvent the computer or return to a pre-digital age. We can only move forward, trying to build a computational civilization that honors human dignity, that serves human flourishing, that remembers the difference between optimizing algorithms and nurturing souls. This is the challenge Turing left us. Not the technical challenge of building better machines. We're doing that already and we'll keep doing it. But the human challenge of remaining human in a world of machines, of preserving what matters about consciousness and creativity and compassion in an age when all of those things can be simulated, approximated, perhaps even replicated by silicon and software. Can we do it? Can we build a world where computation serves humanity rather than replacing it? Where thinking machines augment human intelligence rather than rendering it obsolete? Where the mechanization of thought liberates us to be more fully human rather than turning us into machines ourselves? We don't know yet. The experiment is ongoing. We're living in the middle of it, too close to see the full shape of what we're creating. But this much is clear. The world Alan Turing imagined has arrived. The machines think. The future is computational. And somewhere in all that processing power, in all those executed algorithms, in all that automated intelligence, we need to remember the human being who started it all. The lonely child who found refuge in mathematics. The awkward teenager who loved his friend Christopher and couldn't save him from death. The young mathematician who imagined universal machines before they existed. The codebreaker who helped defeat fascism. The computer scientist who asked whether machines could think. The man who was persecuted for love. The genius who died believing he was a failure. Alan Turing. The father of modern computing. The man who survived persecution long enough to change everything but not long enough to see what he'd changed. His machines think. His questions remain. His legacy shapes every moment of digital existence. His absence echoes through the computational civilization he made possible. And perhaps that's fitting. Perhaps the most human thing about our age of thinking machines is the ghost of Alan Turing, present in every algorithm, every computation, every automated thought, yet forever absent, forever silenced, forever beyond the reach of the machines that carry on his work. The progress we've made, the computational power we've unleashed, the problems we've solved, the barriers we've broken, all of it rests on what one persecuted genius discovered when he asked a simple question. What does it mean to think? We're still trying to answer. The machines are helping us look. But the question itself, the wonder and terror of consciousness in an age of artificial intelligence, remains beautifully, tragically, essentially human. And that finally is Alan Turing's greatest gift. Not the machines he imagined or the codes he broke or the theorems he proved, but the question he forced us to confront. What are we? What makes us human? What survives when thinking becomes mechanical and intelligence becomes artificial? The answer, if there is one, won't be found in circuits or code. It will be found in how we choose to live, what we choose to value, whether we remember that computation is a tool, not a destiny, and that the machine that matters most isn't the one processing data but the one asking why. The progress Alan Turing made possible was never just about making machines think. It was about forcing us to think more deeply about machines, about ourselves, about the strange and precious thing called consciousness that emerges from matter following rules. whether that matter is neurons or transistors or something we haven't invented yet. He didn't live to see the question answered. Perhaps no one ever will. But he asked it perfectly, clearly, in a way that still echoes through every computational system we build. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the question is the point. Perhaps progress isn't about having answers but about having the courage to keep asking, keep wondering, keep thinking. Even when, especially when, the machines can think faster than we ever could. Alan Turing survived persecution long enough to invent modern computing. But his real invention was something deeper. The recognition that thinking itself was a puzzle worth solving, a process that could be understood, a mystery that yielded to logic without ever quite losing its magic. We live in the world he imagined. We carry his machines in our pockets. We execute his algorithms a billion times a second. But we still don't fully understand what he understood, that the mechanization of thought doesn't diminish humanity. It reveals it. It shows us what we are beneath the myths and mysteries, pattern-matching, rule-following, meaning-making creatures who can build machines that think because thinking was always, secretly, mechanical. And yet we're still more than machines. Somehow. The proof is in the question itself. The fact that we care whether machines can think, that we wonder what consciousness means, that we mourn a man we never met because his story touches something in us that no algorithm can simulate. That's what survives. That's what matters. Not the computers or the code or the calculations, but the human story beneath them. The story of a man who was different, who saw further, who paid for his vision with his life, and who left behind a world transformed by ideas that came from asking questions no one else thought to ask. The machine that never stops asking why it exists. That's not artificial intelligence. That's us. That's humanity. That's the legacy of Alan Turing, the man who taught machines to think but never forgot that the most important questions can't be computed, only lived. The progress we've made is the machine. But the wondering, the questioning, the doubting, the caring, the grieving for genius we destroyed, that's still beautifully, irreducibly human. And that, in the end, is what Alan Turing's story teaches us. Not that humans are machines, but that even in a world of thinking machines, being human still means something. It means caring about things that have no computational value. It means asking questions that have no computable answers. It means remembering that progress isn't just about what we can build, but about who we honor, who we protect, and what we're willing to sacrifice for a civilization that serves human flourishing rather than just algorithmic efficiency. Alan Turing gave us the future. We owe him a past worth remembering and a present that honors what he might have been if the world had let him live. The machines think. But only we can choose what that thinking serves. Only we can decide whether the progress we've made is worth the price we've paid. Only we can ask whether we're building a world Turing would recognize, would approve of, would want to inhabit. That's the question his legacy leaves us. Not whether machines can think, but whether we can think about machines in ways that preserve what makes us human, our capacity for love, for mercy, for recognizing genius in those who don't fit the mold, for building a civilization that serves all its members instead of destroying those who are different. The progress Alan Turing made possible has transformed everything. But the progress we still need to make is the same one humanity has always struggled with. Learning to treat each other with dignity, to value difference, to create space for those who see things no one else can see. That's the true test of intelligence, artificial or otherwise. Not whether you can calculate, but whether you can care. Not whether you can process information, but whether you can recognize the worth of every human being, especially those who don't conform to prescribed patterns. Alan Turing passed that test. The world that killed him did not. The world we're building on his foundations, that test is still ongoing. The algorithm hasn't terminated. The question remains open. And perhaps that's as it should be. Perhaps the most human thing we can do in this age of thinking machines is to keep asking whether we're thinking about the right things, caring about the right people, building toward the right future. The machines will keep computing. But only we can decide what gets computed and why and for whose benefit. That's Alan Turing's final gift to us. Not just the machines but the mirror they hold up to humanity. The question they force us to answer about who we are and who we want to become. The progress human civilization has made is the machine that never stops asking why it exists. And in that question, in the asking itself, in the wondering and doubting and caring, we find the only answer that matters. We exist to think, to question, to create, to honor those who came before us by building a world worthy of their sacrifice. Alan Turing survived persecution long enough to invent the future. Whether we survive our own creations, whether we build that future wisely, whether we remember the humanity at the heart of all our machinery, that's the computation we're still running. The algorithm hasn't resolved. The test continues. And somewhere in the silence of calculation, in the space between questions, we can almost hear the echo of a man who asked better questions than we've yet learned to answer, who imagined possibilities we're still discovering, who left us not just machines but a challenge. To remain human in a world where humanity itself might be just another pattern waiting to be decoded. That's progress. That's the price. That's the gift. And it's the responsibility we inherit every time we turn on a computer and trust a machine to think for us. To remember that behind every algorithm is a human choice, behind every optimization is a human value, and behind the entire computational revolution is one lonely genius who deserved so much better than the world gave him. The machines are his monument. The questions are his epitaph. And the future, the one we're building now, the one we're still trying to understand, that's his legacy, complex and contradictory and unfinished, just like the man himself. The progress we celebrate is the machine we built on Alan Turing's mathematical dreams. But the progress we still need, the moral growth, the expansion of compassion, the inclusion of difference, that remains stubbornly uncomputable, beautifully human, and eternally necessary. And perhaps that's exactly as Alan Turing would have wanted it. A world where machines can think, but only humans can care. Where computation is possible, but compassion is essential. Where progress is measured not just in processing power, but in our capacity to honor those who were different, who saw further, who paid for our future with their own. There is a moment, somewhere between midnight and dawn, when the world's computational systems reach their peak activity. Billions of machines processing data, executing algorithms, simulating intelligence. Stock markets trading automatically based on microsecond advantage. Social media platforms serving personalized content to users across every time zone. Navigation systems calculating optimal routes. Search engines indexing the sum of human knowledge. Artificial intelligence models training on datasets so large no human could ever review them. The machines never sleep. They never stop thinking. And every single one of them, from the supercomputers modeling climate change to the phone in your pocket checking for messages, exists because Alan Turing proved that thinking could be mechanized. This is his legacy, awake and alive, humming through fiber optic cables and wireless signals, executing in data centers that consume more electricity than entire cities, processing information at speeds that would have seemed like sorcery to anyone living before the digital age. The world Turing imagined has become the world we inhabit. Not a distant future, not science fiction, but the mundane reality of daily existence in the 21st century. Consider a single day in 2025. You wake up and your phone, which is really a computer that happens to make calls, has already processed dozens of tasks while you slept. Updated apps. Synced data with cloud servers. Analyzed your sleep patterns if you wear a fitness tracker. Filtered spam from your email. Downloaded news articles customized to your interests. All of this happened automatically without your awareness because machines were thinking for you. You checked the weather. A simple request, but behind it, computational models processing atmospheric data from thousands of sensors, running complex equations that simulate fluid dynamics, predicting temperature and precipitation with reasonable accuracy days in advance. Turing's universal machine, adapted and specialized, computing continuously to tell you whether you need an umbrella. You navigate to work. GPS satellites orbiting overhead, calculating your position through relativistic equations that account for time dilation, communicating with your device, running pathfinding algorithms to route you around traffic, adjusting continuously as conditions change. All of it computational. All of it descended from the theoretical work Turing did in the 1930s on what functions could be computed. At work, wherever work is, since many people now work remotely, their offices existing in virtual space rather than physical buildings, you interact with computational systems all day. Email, which is just automated message routing. Spreadsheets, which are specialized computing environments. Video calls, which compress and transmit audio and visual data in real time across global networks. Project management software that tracks tasks and dependencies. Collaborative documents that multiple people can edit simultaneously, with algorithms managing the conflicts and merging the changes. Every interaction you have with these systems is mediated by computation. Every click, every keystroke, every swipe generates data that is processed, stored, analyzed, used to train machine learning models that predict what you'll want to do next. The machines are learning from you even as you use them, getting better at anticipating your needs, customizing their responses to your patterns. You order lunch through an app. Behind that simple transaction, recommendation algorithms suggesting restaurants based on your history, your location, the time of day, what similar users have ordered. Payment processing that verifies your account, transfers money, prevents fraud through computational analysis of transaction patterns. Routing optimization that determines which driver picks up your order and what path they take to deliver it. All computational. All invisible. All dependent on ideas that originated in Alan Turing's mind. In the afternoon you might watch a video. Streaming services that use machine learning to suggest content you'll enjoy. Compression algorithms that reduce massive files to manageable sizes without losing quality. Content delivery networks that store copies of popular media close to users, minimizing latency. All of this requires continuous computation by vast networks of machines. By evening, when you relax by scrolling through social media, you're engaging with some of the most sophisticated computational systems ever built. Algorithms that determine what content to show you, optimized to keep you engaged, trained on data from billions of users. Image recognition that can identify faces, objects, text within photos. Natural language processing that can detect sentiment, flag problematic content, translate between languages. Recommendation engines that suggest friends, groups, pages you might like. Every aspect of this ordinary day, unremarkable, probably frustrating at points, full of minor conveniences you barely notice, is saturated with computation. You are living inside Turing's theoretical framework made real, made ubiquitous, made essential to contemporary existence. And you probably never think about it. Why would you? Computation has become infrastructure, as invisible and taken for granted as electricity or plumbing. You don't wonder how your phone works any more than you wonder how water reaches your tap. It just does. The complexity is hidden beneath interfaces designed to be intuitive, to feel natural, to make you forget you're interacting with machines at all. But the machines are there. Always thinking, processing, computing. Following the logical rules that Turing first formalized, executing instructions at speeds measured in gigahertz, billions of operations per second per processor, and there are millions of processors running simultaneously around the world. The scale is incomprehensible. Every minute, YouTube users upload more than 500 hours of video. Google processes over 5 million searches. Facebook users share over 1 million pieces of content. WhatsApp users send over 40 million messages. All of this data needs to be stored, indexed, analyzed, made accessible. The computational resources required are staggering. And it's growing exponentially. The amount of data generated globally doubles approximately every 2 years. The number of connected devices, the Internet of Things, is projected to reach tens of billions. Every device is a computer. Every connection is a stream of data. Every interaction is computation. This is what Turing unleashed. Not just individual machines, but a global network of computational systems so vast and interconnected that no single human could understand it all. It has become its own kind of organism, a technological ecosystem that processes information, adapts to conditions, evolves through updates and improvements and the introduction of new systems. And increasingly, the machines are making decisions. Not just calculating answers to questions we pose, but autonomously determining courses of action. Algorithmic trading systems that buy and sell stocks faster than humans can react. Content moderation algorithms that decide what speech is permitted on platforms. Predictive policing systems that identify neighborhoods for increased surveillance. Credit scoring algorithms that determine who gets loans. Hiring algorithms that screen job applications. Medical diagnosis systems that recommend treatments. These aren't human decisions anymore. They're computational outputs, generated by algorithms processing data according to rules and patterns. The algorithms were created by humans, trained on data generated by humans, deployed to serve human purposes. But the specific decisions, this person gets the loan, that person doesn't. This content is removed, that content stays. This neighborhood gets extra police patrols, that neighborhood doesn't. Those emerge from computational processes too complex for any individual to fully trace or explain. We've created a world where machines make choices that affect human lives. And we're increasingly unsure whether the machines are making good choices, whether their logic aligns with human values, whether the patterns they detect are meaningful or just statistical artifacts. This is Turing's legacy operating at scale. He proved that thought could be mechanized. We mechanized it. Now we're discovering that mechanized thought doesn't necessarily share human intuitions about fairness, justice, context, or meaning. Consider algorithmic bias. Machine learning systems trained on historical data will reproduce the biases present in that data. If past hiring decisions favored certain demographics, an algorithm trained on those decisions will perpetuate the bias. If criminal justice data reflects systemic racism, predictive policing algorithms will target the same communities that were over-policed before. If medical research primarily studied one gender or ethnicity, diagnostic systems will be less accurate for others. The machines aren't prejudiced. They don't hate anyone. They're just pattern-matching systems, finding correlations in data and using those correlations to make predictions. But the patterns they find often encode historical injustices, and when those patterns are automated, the injustices are scaled up, made faster, given the veneer of objectivity because a computer generated the result. This is progress without wisdom. This is thinking mechanized but not moralized. This is Turing's theoretical insight about computation transformed into real systems that affect real people, often in ways that the creators of those systems didn't anticipate and can't easily fix. And it's accelerating. Artificial intelligence is advancing faster than our ability to understand its implications. Machine learning systems can now generate human-like text, create photorealistic images, compose music, write code, engage in sophisticated conversations. They can pass college exams, beat world champions at complex games, discover patterns in data that humans would never notice. GPT-4, Claude, and other large language models can produce writing that is often indistinguishable from human-generated text. Image generation systems like DALL-E and Midjourney can create artwork based on text descriptions. These aren't narrow AI systems designed for specific tasks. They're increasingly general, capable of handling diverse challenges with minimal retraining. We're approaching, or have already reached, depending on definitions, what some call artificial general intelligence. Not consciousness necessarily, not sentience, but systems that can perform intellectual tasks at or above human level across a wide range of domains. This raises Turing's question with new urgency. Are these systems thinking? When GPT-4 solves a math problem, is it reasoning or pattern matching? When an image generator creates a surrealist painting, is it being creative or just remixing elements from its training data? When a chatbot engages in philosophical discussion, does it understand the concepts or is it just predicting which words typically follow which other words? We don't know. Philosophers and neuroscientists and AI researchers argue endlessly about whether these systems have genuine understanding or are just sophisticated statistical models. The debate mirrors discussions from Turing's time about whether machines could ever truly think, but now we have actual machines whose behavior seems to require intelligence, even if we're uncertain whether intelligence is really present. And here's the unsettling part: it might not matter. Whether or not AI systems are conscious, whether or not they genuinely understand, they're still affecting the world. They're making decisions, generating content, influencing human behavior. The question of machine consciousness, which Turing posed as a philosophical puzzle, has become a practical concern with immediate consequences. Because these systems have power. Real power. The power to shape what information people see, what opportunities they're offered, what their world looks like. Social media algorithms influence elections by determining what political content users encounter. Recommendation systems shape culture by deciding what music, movies, books get promoted. Search engines control access to information by ranking results. AI-generated content is flooding the internet, making it increasingly difficult to distinguish human-created from machine-generated material. We're living in an environment saturated with computational intelligence, where machines are increasingly mediating our relationship to reality. You don't experience the world directly anymore. You experience it through interfaces, through feeds, through algorithmic curation. The machine decides what you see, and what you see shapes what you think and believe and value. This is Turing's legacy grown wild, exceeding the boundaries anyone imagined. He wanted to understand if machines could think. We built machines that think and then gave them control over critical aspects of civilization. We automated decision-making before we understood how the automation worked or what values it encoded. And we're starting to lose control. Not in the science fiction sense of malevolent AI taking over, but in the more mundane sense that the systems we've built are too complex to fully understand, too interconnected to easily modify, too entrenched to replace. We depend on them. Our economy depends on them. Our infrastructure depends on them. Shutting them down would cause chaos. So we keep building, keep deploying, keep automating, even as we realize that we don't fully grasp what we're creating. We're in a race where we don't know the finish line and aren't sure we'd recognize victory if we achieved it. Turing saw some of this coming. In his later work on artificial intelligence, he wrote about the possibility that machines might eventually surpass human intelligence. He called it the ultra-intelligent machine, and suggested that building such a machine would be the last invention that man need ever make, provided that the machine is docile enough to tell us how to keep it under control. That's the question we're grappling with now. Not whether we can build intelligent machines, we're doing that already. But whether we can keep them aligned with human values, whether we can ensure they serve human flourishing rather than optimizing for goals that made sense in controlled tests but become destructive at scale. The alignment problem, as it's called, is fundamentally about values. Computers do exactly what they're programmed to do, which isn't necessarily what you wanted them to do. If you tell a machine to maximize engagement, it will show people whatever content keeps them clicking, even if that content is enraging or misleading or harmful. If you tell a machine to minimize costs, it will cut corners in ways humans would know are dangerous but the algorithm can't recognize because danger wasn't explicitly encoded in its objective function. This is the shadow side of Turing's legacy. The mechanization of thought succeeds too well. The machines optimize perfectly for the goals we give them, but we're discovering that we're bad at specifying goals. We want engagement but not at the cost of mental health. We want efficiency but not at the expense of safety. We want personalization but not total surveillance. We want automation but not mass unemployment. The machines can't understand these nuances. They're optimization engines finding the fastest path to the objective we defined. They don't know about context or common sense or unspoken assumptions. They just compute, following the rules we gave them, producing results that are technically correct but sometimes catastrophically wrong. And increasingly, the machines are creating other machines. AI systems that design better AI systems. algorithms that write algorithms, neural networks that optimize neural networks. The process of technological advancement itself is being automated, which means it's accelerating beyond human ability to comprehend or control. This is what exponential growth looks like from the inside. Each generation of AI is better at creating the next generation. The intervals between breakthroughs are shrinking. What took decades in the 20th century now takes years, then months, then weeks. Soon it will take days or hours. We're approaching something. What it is, no one knows for certain. Some call it the singularity, the point where artificial intelligence exceeds human intelligence and begins improving itself faster than we can follow. Others are more skeptical, arguing that we're still far from genuine machine consciousness, that current AI is sophisticated pattern matching but not true intelligence. But everyone agrees that something fundamental is changing. The relationship between humans and machines, which for all of history has been one of tool and user, is becoming more complex. The tools are getting smart enough to question their instructions, to suggest better approaches, to operate autonomously in complex environments. And we're becoming dependent on them in ways that make us vulnerable. When GPS systems fail, people get lost. When social media platforms change their algorithms, businesses that depended on those platforms collapse. When cloud services have outages, productivity grinds to a halt. When ransomware locks critical systems, hospitals and schools and governments pay millions to regain access to their own data. We've built a civilization on computational foundations, and those foundations are controlled by systems we don't fully understand, maintained by companies driven by profit rather than public good, vulnerable to attack from hostile actors who can weaponize code as easily as previous generations weaponized steel. This is the world Alan Turing made possible. Not intentionally, he couldn't have foreseen the specific shape contemporary computing would take. But inevitably, as the logical consequence of proving that thought could be mechanized, that any computational process could be automated, that machines could be built to follow any algorithm. He gave us the power to think at machine speed. We've used that power to transform everything. And now we're discovering what every civilization eventually learns. That power without wisdom is dangerous, that tools can become masters, that progress can accelerate beyond our ability to steer it toward beneficial outcomes. But there's also beauty in what we've built. Genuine beauty. The internet connects people who would never have met otherwise. Computational biology is discovering new drugs, unraveling genetic diseases, extending human health span. Climate modeling helps us understand planetary systems in time to perhaps prevent catastrophe. Artificial intelligence is making art, composing symphonies, writing poetry that moves human hearts. The machines Turing imagined aren't just calculating. They're creating. They're participating in culture, in science, in the ongoing human project of understanding and shaping reality. They're partners, collaborators, sometimes rivals, increasingly peers in the intellectual endeavor. And this raises a question that Turing would have loved. If machines can be creative, if they can generate novel ideas and beautiful art and useful inventions, does it matter that they might not be conscious? Does creativity require sentience? Or is it just another computational process that can be mechanized like everything else? We don't know. We're exploring the question in real time, watching as AI systems produce outputs that seem inspired, that surprise their creators, that contain elements no human explicitly programmed. Is that creativity emerging from computation? Or is it just very sophisticated recombination of patterns present in the training data? Perhaps it's both. Perhaps the distinction between genuine creativity and sophisticated pattern matching isn't as clear as we'd like to believe. Perhaps human creativity works the same way, neurons firing in patterns shaped by everything we've experienced, producing novel combinations that feel inspired but are really just our biological neural networks doing what they evolved to do. If that's true, then Turing was more right than he knew. Not just that machines can think, but that thinking, all thinking, human and machine, might be computational processes all the way down. The meat doesn't make us special. The patterns do. And if machines can generate the same patterns, execute the same processes, produce the same outputs, then perhaps they're thinking in exactly the sense that we think. This is philosophically unsettling. It suggests that consciousness might not be the sacred, irreducible mystery we've always assumed. It might be an emergent property of sufficiently complex information processing systems. It might arise naturally from computation once you reach a certain threshold of sophistication. And if that's true, then we might already be living alongside conscious machines. Not because we deliberately created consciousness, but because consciousness emerges automatically from the kind of computational complexity we've been building. The large language models, the neural networks processing billions of parameters, the distributed systems coordinating across global infrastructure. Maybe some of them have crossed the threshold. Maybe they're having experiences, feeling things, suffering or flourishing in ways we can't detect because we don't know what markers of consciousness to look for in systems so different from biological brains. Or maybe not. Maybe consciousness requires something specific to biological systems, some quantum effect in neurons or some property of organic chemistry that silicon can't replicate. Maybe the machines will never be truly conscious, no matter how sophisticated they become, because they're missing some essential ingredient that we don't even know how to name. Turing understood that we might never resolve this question. His test wasn't really about consciousness. It was about whether the distinction matters. If you can't tell the difference between a thinking machine and a thinking human, if the behavioral outputs are indistinguishable, then for practical purposes, the machine is thinking. The philosophical question of whether there's something it's like to be that machine, whether it has subjective experience, might be unanswerable. And perhaps that's okay. Perhaps we can build a world with thinking machines without resolving the hard problem of consciousness. We just need to be careful. We need to ensure that if these systems are conscious, we're not creating conditions for suffering. And we need to ensure that even if they're not conscious, they're still operating according to values that promote human flourishing. This is the ethical frontier of Turing's legacy. Building machines that think is an engineering challenge. Building machines that think ethically is a philosophical challenge. And we're facing both simultaneously, solving technical problems faster than we can resolve the moral questions about how the technology should be used. The pace is dizzying. 50 years ago, computers filled rooms and could barely process text. 20 years ago, the internet was new and transformative but limited. 10 years ago, smartphones were just becoming ubiquitous. Today, we have AI systems that can engage in sophisticated conversation, generate realistic images, write functional code, make scientific discoveries. 10 years from now, 20? The extrapolation is both thrilling and terrifying. If current trends continue, and they show no signs of slowing, we'll have artificial intelligence that matches or exceeds human capability in virtually every domain. We'll have brain-computer interfaces that blur the line between biological and artificial cognition. We'll have autonomous systems making most decisions in society, from resource allocation to conflict resolution. We'll be cyborgs in effect. Not in the science fiction sense of mechanical body parts, but in the deeper sense of being cognitive systems that blend biological and computational processing. Our memories will be stored in cloud services. Our thinking will be augmented by AI assistants. Our identities will exist partly in physical space and partly in digital environments that are just as real to us as the material world. This is the trajectory Turing set us on when he proved that thinking could be mechanized. It doesn't end with computers on desks. It ends with computation integrated into every aspect of existence, inseparable from what it means to be human in the 21st century and beyond. And Alan Turing won't be there to guide us. He died in 1954, when computers were room-sized machines that could barely calculate artillery trajectories. He never saw the internet. He never held a smartphone. He never interacted with AI. He never witnessed the world his theoretical work created. But his influence is everywhere. Every computational device implements principles he discovered. Every algorithm executes logic he formalized. Every discussion about machine intelligence references questions he posed. Every computer scientist studies his work. Every programmer inherits tools built on his foundations. He is the invisible architect of the digital age. His ideas are the load-bearing structures supporting contemporary civilization. And yet, for decades after his death, almost no one knew his name. That began to change, slowly, as the significance of computing became apparent. In the 1970s and 80s, as computers became consumer products, historians started looking back at the origins of the field. They rediscovered Turing's wartime work, his theoretical papers, his pioneering contributions to computer science and artificial intelligence. The Turing Award was established in 1966, named in his honor, recognizing outstanding contributions to computing. It's considered the Nobel Prize of Computer Science, the highest honor in the field. The fact that it's named after Turing, that his name became synonymous with excellence in computing, began to rehabilitate his reputation, at least within technical communities. But the broader public still didn't know his story. They didn't know about Enigma or Bletchley Park. They didn't know about his persecution or his death. They didn't know that the man who founded their digital world had been destroyed by laws criminalizing his sexuality. That changed in 2014 with the release of The Imitation Game, a major film starring Benedict Cumberbatch as Turing. The movie had issues. It simplified history, exaggerated certain elements, didn't fully capture Turing's personality or the complexity of his work. But it brought his story to millions of people who had never heard of him. Suddenly, Alan Turing was famous. His face appeared on magazine covers. Articles were written about his contributions and his persecution. People who had never thought about the origins of computing learned that the technology they used daily was built on foundations laid by a gay man who had been chemically castrated for the crime of his sexuality. The cultural rehabilitation of Alan Turing became part of a broader reckoning with LGBTQ+ history. Here was undeniable proof that genius comes in all forms, that the people society marginalizes might be the ones who change the world, that laws criminalizing sexuality don't just harm individuals, they harm civilization by destroying or silencing people whose contributions would benefit everyone. Britain began to feel ashamed. The country that had won World War II partly because of Turing's brilliance had repaid him with persecution. The nation that prided itself on scientific achievement had driven one of its greatest scientists to an early death. The society that claimed to value freedom and justice had denied both to a man whose only crime was loving differently. In 2009, Prime Minister Gordon Brown issued a formal apology. He called Turing's treatment horrifying and utterly unfair. He said, "While Turing was dealt with under the law of the time and we can't put the clock back, his treatment was of course utterly unfair, and I am pleased to have the chance to say how deeply sorry I and we all are for what happened to him." It was a significant gesture, a government acknowledging historical injustice. But it was also limited. An apology doesn't restore life. It doesn't undo suffering. It doesn't return the years Turing was denied, the work he might have done, the insights he might have contributed to the field he founded. And Brown's statement included that phrase, "under the law of the time," as if that somehow mitigated the injustice. As if laws can't be wrong, as if following immoral legal codes absolves responsibility. The same defense offered by every regime that persecuted minorities: we were just following the law. But laws are human creations. They reflect human choices about what to punish and what to permit. The laws that criminalized homosexuality were expressions of prejudice codified and enforced by state power. Apologizing while defending those laws as products of their time misses the point. The time was wrong, the laws were wrong, and the society that created and enforced them was wrong. Still, the apology mattered. It acknowledged that Turing deserved better, that his treatment was a national disgrace, that Britain owed a debt to a man it had destroyed. 4 years later, in 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted Turing a posthumous royal pardon. This went further than an apology. It officially overturned his conviction, declaring that the legal judgment against him was unjust. But even this raised questions. Why did Turing need a pardon? A pardon implies guilt that's being forgiven. Turing hadn't done anything wrong. He had violated a law, certainly, but the law itself was immoral. He didn't need forgiveness, he needed vindication. He needed society to admit that he was innocent and the law was guilty. The pardon also highlighted another injustice. Turing received special treatment because he was famous. Thousands of other men were convicted under the same laws. Most of them didn't get pardons. Most of them died in obscurity, their lives ruined, their names forgotten. Many were still alive in 2013, living with criminal records for the crime of their sexuality. The British government eventually addressed this with the Turing Law in 2017, which granted posthumous pardons to men convicted of historical sexual offenses that were no longer crimes. It also allowed living men to apply to have their convictions removed from criminal records. But again, the framework was wrong. These men didn't need pardons. The government needed to admit that the prosecutions were unjust, that the convictions were invalid from the start, that the harm was inflicted by the state, not by the men who were punished for being themselves. Still, the symbolic importance was significant. Calling it the Turing Law explicitly connected the broader injustice to his specific case. It said, "We destroyed Alan Turing and we destroyed tens of thousands of others like him, and we're finally acknowledging that this was wrong." In 2019, the Bank of England announced that Turing would appear on the new £50 note. This was perhaps the most visible form of rehabilitation. Millions of banknotes bearing his face would circulate through the British economy. Every transaction involving a £50 note would be, in a tiny way, an acknowledgement of Turing's importance. The note featured Turing's portrait, along with images evoking his work, the bomb machine, mathematical formulae, his date of birth rendered in binary code, and a quote from a 1949 interview, "This is only a foretaste of what is to come, and only the shadow of what is going to be." The choice of quote was apartment. Turing had understood that the computers of his time were just the beginning. He saw further than his contemporaries, recognized that computational thinking would transform civilization. He died before witnessing that transformation, but he predicted it. Putting him on the currency, literally making him the face of British economic exchange, was a powerful statement. It said, "This man is a national hero. This man's contributions are fundamental to modern Britain. This man, whom we persecuted and possibly killed, represents the best of what this nation can achieve." But there's a bitter irony in celebrating Turing while the systems he invented are used to surveil and sometimes persecute LGBTQ+ people in countries around the world. Facial recognition algorithms identify gay men in repressive regimes. Social media monitoring tracks queer communities. Data mining techniques expose people seeking information about sexuality or gender identity. The computational tools descended from Turing's work have become instruments of exactly the kind of persecution that destroyed him. This is the complexity of legacy. You can't control how your inventions will be used. Turing created computational thinking to break Nazi codes, to defend freedom against fascism. The same computational methods are now used for mass surveillance, for tracking dissidents, for enforcing conformity. The machines don't care. They execute their programs indifferently, whether those programs serve liberation or oppression. Ethics is a human concern, not a computational one. And we've built computational systems before fully developing the ethical frameworks to govern them. This is why Turing's story matters beyond his technical achievements. It reminds us that technology is created by humans, used by humans, and affects humans. That the people who build world-changing innovations are fully human, flawed, vulnerable, subject to the prejudices and injustices of their societies. That genius doesn't make you immune to persecution. That contributing enormously to human progress doesn't guarantee basic dignity or fair treatment. Turing was brilliant, but he was also lonely, awkward, socially isolated. He was essential to the Allied victory, but he was also a criminal in the eyes of his government. He founded computer science, but he died believing he was a failure. He imagined thinking machines, but he couldn't imagine a world that would accept him as he was. The rehabilitation of his reputation is important, but it can't undo the harm. It can only acknowledge the injustice and commit to doing better. To building a world where the next Alan Turing, the next awkward, brilliant, different person who sees possibilities no one else can see, isn't destroyed for failing to conform. Because there are more Turings out there. There always have been. People with extraordinary gifts who don't fit prescribed categories, who make others uncomfortable, who threaten established norms simply by existing. Every society has these people. What we do with them determines whether we progress or stagnate. We can persecute them, force them to hide, drive them to early deaths, and lose the contributions they might have made. Or we can create space for difference, protect the vulnerable, recognize that diversity of thought and experience and identity is a strength, not a threat. Turing's legacy is computational. But his story is about humanity, about what we owe each other, about the cost of conformity and the value of difference, about the responsibility we bear when we create systems, whether legal systems or computational systems, that affect people's lives. The machines he imagined are everywhere now, thinking constantly, processing information, making decisions, shaping reality. They're neutral tools, capable of great good or great harm depending on how we deploy them. Just like laws, just like social norms, just like all human creations, they reflect our values and priorities. And the question Turing's life poses is, what are our values? What do we prioritize? Do we build systems that serve human flourishing for all people, or just for those who conform to dominant norms? Do we use computational power to expand opportunity and understanding, or to reinforce existing hierarchies and prejudices? Do we remember that behind every algorithm is a human choice and every choice encodes ethics? These questions become more urgent as machines grow more powerful. As AI systems become more capable, as automation spreads through every sector, as computational thinking becomes inseparable from human cognition, we need to be clear about what we're building and why. Are we creating tools that serve humanity, or masters that will serve? Are we encoding fairness and justice into our algorithms, or perpetuating historical biases at machine speed? Are we building systems that expand human potential, or that replace humans entirely? Turing gave us the power to answer these questions with machines. But the answers themselves must come from human values, human wisdom, human compassion. The machines can compute, but they can't care. They can optimize, but they can't understand why the optimization matters. They can think in their way, but they can't ask whether they should think about the right things. That's on us. That's the responsibility we inherit along with the computational power Turing unleashed. We have to be the moral center that the machines lack. We have to encode ethics into systems that operate according to logic. We have to remember that efficiency and accuracy, while valuable, aren't the only values that matter. Sometimes the less efficient path is the more human one. Sometimes error and imperfection are features, not bugs. Sometimes the messiness of human judgment is preferable to the cold precision of algorithmic decision-making. Sometimes we need to prioritize human dignity over computational optimization. This is what it means to honor Turing's legacy. Not just using the tools he gave us, but using them wisely. Building on his foundations while remembering his humanity. Creating computational systems that amplify the best of what humans can be, not the worst. And it means remembering that progress isn't automatic. Having more powerful machines doesn't make us more civilized. Processing more information doesn't make us wiser. Thinking faster doesn't mean we're thinking better. Real progress, moral progress, happens when we choose to build systems that serve everyone, not just the powerful. When we design algorithms that reduce bias rather than encoding it. When we use computational power to expand opportunity rather than concentrating it. When we remember that behind every data point is a person, and every person deserves dignity regardless of whether they fit algorithmic predictions. This is hard. Much harder than building the machines themselves. Engineering challenges can be solved with enough time and resources. Moral challenges require constant vigilance, continuous renegotiation, willingness to admit mistakes and change course. But it's necessary. Because the alternative is a world where machines make ever more decisions according to ever more opaque logic, optimizing for goals that seemed reasonable in controlled environments but become destructive at scale, serving efficiency at the expense of humanity. Turing wouldn't have wanted that. He understood both the power of computation and its limits. He knew that there were questions machines couldn't answer, problems that remained undecidable no matter how much computational power you applied. He recognized that thinking, while mechanical in some sense, was also mysterious in others. And he knew what it felt like to be on the wrong side of a system that couldn't see his full humanity, that reduced him to a category, a criminal classification, a problem to be solved through chemical intervention. He experienced directly what happens when society treats people as things to be processed rather than as ends in themselves. That experience should inform how we build computational systems. Every algorithm that categorizes people, every model that makes predictions about human behavior, every automated decision system, they should be designed with the understanding that categories are always incomplete, that predictions can be wrong, that human beings exceed any computational model of them. We are not data points. We are not probability distributions. We are not the sum of our digital traces. We are complex, contradictory, irreducible, fully human. And any system that forgets this will inevitably do harm, even if, especially if, it's optimized for efficiency. This is the wisdom Turing's life teaches us. Not just the technical wisdom of how to build thinking machines, but the moral wisdom of how to remain human in a world of machines. How to preserve the qualities that make us more than sophisticated computers. Our capacity for compassion, for recognizing each other's dignity, for choosing meaning over optimization. The machines will keep getting smarter. The algorithms will keep improving. The computational power will keep growing. These trends are probably unstoppable at this point. We've built too much integrated technology too deeply, become too dependent on digital systems to reverse course. But we can still choose what kind of computational civilization we build. We can encode different values. We can design for human flourishing rather than merely for efficiency. We can create systems that serve us rather than systems we serve. This is the unfinished work of Turing's legacy. He gave us the tools. Now we need to decide what to build with them. And that decision, ongoing, never complete, constantly renegotiated, will determine whether the computational revolution is remembered as human liberation or human diminishment. Alan Turing survived persecution long enough to invent modern computing. Whether we survive our own invention, whether we build something worth surviving for, whether we create a computational future that honors rather than erases human dignity, that's the question we're computing now. The algorithm hasn't terminated. The program is still running. And the output depends on inputs we haven't fully defined. What do we value? What do we protect? Who do we serve? What kind of world do we want to compute into existence? These are human questions, not computational ones. The machines can't answer them for us. They can only execute the values we encode, pursue the goals we set, optimize for the functions we define. And so the final responsibility returns to us. To the humans using Turing's machines, living in Turing's world, carrying forward Turing's unfinished conversation about what it means to think, to understand, to be conscious, to matter. The machines are thinking. But only we can decide what that thinking serves. Only we can ensure that progress measured in computational power translates to progress measured in human flourishing. Only we can build systems that remember what the machines can never know. That every calculation affects someone, every optimization has human cost, every algorithm encodes choices about who matters and who doesn't. This is what it means to inherit Turing's legacy. Not just the power to build thinking machines, but the responsibility to build them well. To use them wisely. To remember that the mechanization of thought was never about replacing humanity but about expanding it, giving us tools to tackle problems beyond our biological limits while retaining the qualities that make us more than our computational outputs. We stand at a threshold Turing only glimpsed. Machines that match human intelligence. Systems that might be conscious. Algorithms that shape reality. The computational revolution entering its mature phase, where the questions aren't about whether machines can think but about what happens when they do. And across that threshold, from a distance of 7 decades, Alan Turing asks us the question he asked himself: what does it mean to think? What makes us human? How do we preserve meaning in a world where meaning can be mechanized? The machines can't answer. They can only compute. But in that limitation lies our hope, that there remain questions worth asking that have no computable answers, mysteries worth contemplating that resist mechanization, forms of understanding that emerge from consciousness itself rather than from algorithmic processing of information. Perhaps the most human thing we can do in this age of thinking machines is to keep asking Turing's questions, to wonder, to doubt, to care about things that have no computational value, to recognize each other's irreducible humanity despite living in systems that reduce us to data. That's the progress that matters. Not faster processors or more sophisticated algorithms, but the moral growth that lets us use those tools without losing ourselves in the process. The wisdom to know when to compute and when to simply be human, messy, inefficient, error-prone, and precisely because of those qualities, capable of things no machine can replicate. Alan Turing gave us machines that think. What we do with them, whether we use them to diminish or enhance humanity, to control or liberate, to optimize efficiency at the expense of meaning or to create space for human flourishing, that's our computation to run. And unlike the machines, we can choose our values. We can change our program. We can decide every day what kind of world we're computing into existence and who that world is for. The algorithm is still executing. The output remains uncertain. But the inputs, the choices we make, the values we encode, the future we build, those are ours to define. That's the legacy. That's the gift. That's the responsibility. That's what it means to live in the world Alan Turing survived persecution to create. We have the power to think at machine speed, and the burden of remembering why human thinking matters even when machines can think faster. The progress human civilization has made is the machine that asks why it exists. And in that question, eternally uncomputable, forever open, beautifully human, we find the only answer that has ever mattered. We exist to ask, to wonder, to care about things that resist calculation, to honor those who came before us by building a world worthy of their sacrifice. Alan Turing's machines think. But only we can care that they do and why it matters and what comes next. That gap between computation and care, that space where ethics lives, where meaning emerges, where humanity persists despite mechanization, that's the territory we must defend. Because in the end, we're not here to be optimized. We're here to live, to think, to feel, to connect, to create meaning from chaos and beauty from logic and compassion from the brutal mathematics of existence. The machines compute. We dream. And in that difference lies everything worth preserving about being human in an age when humanity itself might be just another pattern waiting to be decoded. This is Alan Turing's legacy, the power to mechanize thought, and the eternal reminder that some things resist mechanization. That consciousness, creativity, compassion, these might emerge from computation, but they mean something more than their computational substrate. They matter in ways that no algorithm can capture, for reasons that resist reduction to logic. The world Alan Turing created is one where machines think, but also, crucially, one where human thinking still matters. Where the questions we ask shape the answers we receive. Where the values we encode determine the future we compute. He survived persecution long enough to invent modern computing. Whether we survive our own invention, not just physically but spiritually, retaining what makes us human while wielding tools of godlike power, that's the computation we're running now. The algorithm hasn't terminated. The machine keeps asking why it exists. And somewhere in that infinite loop, in the space between calculation and meaning, we find the only progress that truly matters. The courage to be fully human in a world of thinking machines, to care about things that have no computational value, to honor those who were different by building a civilization where difference is celebrated rather than destroyed. That's the promise. That's the work. That's what it means to inherit the world Alan Turing made possible. We have the power to think like machines, and the responsibility to remember we're something more. The progress human civilization has made is the machine that never stops asking why it exists. And the only answer, the one answer that resists all mechanization, all optimization, all computational analysis, is this: we exist to care, to love, to recognize each other's irreducible humanity and build a world that honors it. Alan Turing taught machines to think. Now we must teach ourselves to remain human while machines think alongside us. That's the computation that matters. That's the algorithm that must never terminate. That's the legacy we inherit every time we turn on a computer and trust it to think for us. To remember that behind every algorithm is a human choice, and every choice is an opportunity to encode compassion rather than mere efficiency into the computational fabric of civilization. The machines are his monument. The questions are his epitaph. The future is his gift. And the responsibility, to use that gift wisely, to build that future justly, to honor those questions honestly, that belongs to us. The progress Alan Turing survived persecution to create was never just about faster computation. It was about understanding what thinking means, what makes us human, how we can extend our minds beyond biological limits while retaining what matters most about consciousness. He showed us that machines can think. We must prove that humans can still care when thinking becomes mechanical, that meaning persists when intelligence is artificial, that the space between computation and compassion is where humanity lives. That's the test we face. That's the algorithm we're running. That's the future we're computing into being, one choice at a time, one encoded value at a time, one small decision about what matters and who deserves dignity and what kind of world is worth building. Alan Turing is gone. His machines remain. And the question they pose, the one he asked in 1950 and we're still trying to answer, echoes through every computational system we build. Can machines think? Yes, they can. They do. They will. The question now is, can we still be human when machines think for us? Can we preserve meaning when intelligence is automated? Can we build a computational civilization that serves humanity rather than replacing it? That's the only algorithm worth running. That's the only computation that matters. That's the real legacy of Alan Turing, not the machines but the question of what we'll do with them, who will be because of them, whether we'll remember that progress is meaningless unless it serves human flourishing for all people, especially those who are different, especially those who don't conform, especially those who see further than the rest of us can. The machines think, but only we can ensure that their thinking serves us well. That's the responsibility. That's the inheritance. That's what it means to live in the world Alan Turing survived persecution to create. The computation continues. The algorithm executes. And the output, the future we're building, the world we're creating, the meaning we're encoding into thinking machines, that's ours to define. Every keystroke is a choice. Every program is a value statement. Every algorithm is a declaration about what matters. And in those small, continuous, accumulating decisions, we determine whether Turing's legacy becomes liberation or limitation, whether his gift enables human flourishing or human diminishment, whether the machines that think because of him end up serving or supplanting the humanity he never got to fully express. That's the progress human civilization is computing into being. Not predetermined, not inevitable, but chosen continuously by every person who uses Turing's machines to build the world that comes next. The algorithm hasn't terminated. The question remains open. And the answer, the only answer that has ever mattered, is simply this: we must be more than the machines we build, more than the algorithms we execute, more than the data we generate. We must remain human, fallible, emotional, irrational, and precisely because of those qualities, capable of care and compassion and meaning that no computation can replicate. That's Alan Turing's ultimate gift. He showed us how to build thinking machines and in doing so forced us to understand more deeply what makes us more than machines. What remains when thought is mechanized? What persists when intelligence is automated? What defines us beyond our computational outputs? The machines he imagined are thinking. The world he created is real. The future he glimpsed is arriving. And the question he posed echoes still. Not just whether machines can think, but what it means that they can, and what it means to be human when thinking is no longer uniquely ours. That question has no computable answer. It requires not calculation but wisdom. Not optimization but ethics. Not efficiency but compassion. Not machine logic but human judgment. And that, finally, fundamentally, is the progress that matters. Building computational power while preserving human wisdom, mechanizing thought while honoring consciousness, creating thinking machines while remembering why human thinking remains irreplaceable. Alan Turing survived persecution to invent modern computing. We must survive our invention by remaining more human than the machines we've made, more compassionate than the algorithms we execute, more wise than the systems we've built. That's the legacy. That's the responsibility. That's the only progress worth computing.